Welcome to the dark corners of your imagination, where nightmares take form and shadows hold secrets. This is Mr. Night's Scares Story, your gateway to the macabre, the unexplained, and the terrifying. Here, we dive deep into the spine-chilling stories that keep you awake at night, true tales of haunted places, unspeakable horrors, and things that go bump in the night. From cursed objects to paranormal encounters, from urban legends to sinister truths, we uncover it all. But beware, these stories have a way of lingering. Once you hear them, they might follow you, whispering in the dark when you're all alone. So, if you dare step into the unknown, subscribe, turn off the lights, and join us as we venture into the shadows. This is Mr. Night's Scares Story, where fear finds you. Story number 1. Whispers in the Attic, a full-length horror story. The house on Briarwood Lane had always been avoided by the locals. The McAllisters, the last family to live there, vanished without a trace in 1978. Since then, rumors swirled about the house. Strange noises, glowing lights in the windows, and most chilling of all, a faint voice calling out from the attic. But for the Harpers, a young family desperate for a fresh start, the stories were nothing more than superstition. The house, offered at a rock-bottom price, seemed like a dream come true. They moved in with their teenage daughter, Jenna, and 8-year-old son, Tommy, excited to turn the dilapidated Victorian home into a sanctuary. Jenna, however, felt uneasy from the start. The air inside the house was heavy, almost suffocating, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The first few days were unremarkable. The family cleaned, painted, and unpacked. Tommy claimed to hear footsteps at night, but their parents dismissed it as the house settling. Jenna tried to convince herself the eerie feeling was just her imagination. Then the whispers began. It was subtle at first, a faint murmur that she could barely make out. But by the third night, the whispers grew louder, unmistakable. They came from above in the attic. "Jenna, come upstairs." She froze, clutching her blanket. Her heart raced as she strained to listen. The voice was soft, almost kind, but undeniably chilling. The next morning, she told her parents about the whispers. "It's probably just the wind," her father said dismissively. "Old houses make weird noises." But Jenna knew better. The attic door. On the 5th night, Jenna was awakened by a loud creak. She sat up, her eyes darting to her bedroom door. It was open. She could have sworn she'd closed it. Her gaze shifted down the hallway. At the far end, the attic door stood slightly ajar. She remembered her father telling her it had been sealed shut. "Jenna." The whisper floated down the hallway, low and inviting. Against her better judgment, she grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the attic. Her fingers trembled as she pushed the door open. The stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed, the air growing colder with every step. The attic was a dark, cavernous space filled with cobwebs and forgotten relics. In the center stood an old mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished. Jenna hesitated, her flashlight beam fixed on the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. It stood still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then it grinned. "Don't you want to see?" it whispered. The voice didn't come from her reflection. It came from the attic itself. Jenna screamed and bolted, slamming the door shut behind her. She ran to her parents' room, begging them to leave the house. Her father was skeptical, but her mother seemed uneasy. Still, they dismissed her as being overtired. Tommy's new friend. The next day, Tommy started acting strangely. He spent hours in his room, talking to someone. When Jenna asked who he was talking to, he smiled and said, "My friend from the attic." Jenna's blood ran cold. "What friend?" "The lady. She's nice," Tommy said innocently. "She says you don't like her, but she likes you." Jenna grabbed his arm. "Tommy, you can't go in the attic, okay? It's not safe." Tommy frowned. "She says it's safe for me." That night, Jenna locked the attic door and kept the key with her. But when she woke up, the door was wide open. The descent into madness. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder and more persistent. Jenna began hearing her name no matter where she was in the house. Sometimes, she'd hear faint laughter or footsteps behind her. But when she turned, no one was there. Her parents started arguing more often, tension creeping into their once happy home. Her mother began forgetting things, simple things like what day it was or where she'd put her keys. Her father grew distant, spending hours staring out the window. One night, Jenna woke to find Tommy standing by her bed. His eyes were glazed, his face pale. "She wants you to come," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. Jenna grabbed him and shook him. Who? Who wants me to come?" "The lady in the mirror." The mirror's secret. Determined to end whatever was tormenting her family, Jenna did something she swore she'd never do. She returned to the attic. This time, she brought a crowbar, ready to smash the mirror. The attic was colder than before, and the metallic smell was stronger. The whispers surrounded her, overlapping into a cacophony. "Jenna, don't." Ignoring the voices, she raised the crowbar and swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered, and for a moment, the whispers stopped. Then, a deafening scream erupted from the shards. Shadows spilled out, writhing and twisting into humanoid forms. Their hollow eyes locked onto Jenna as they hissed in unison, "You've set us free." Jenna fled, but as she reached the door, she saw her family standing at the bottom of the stairs. They weren't themselves. Their eyes were black voids, and their mouths twisted into unnatural smiles. "You shouldn't have done that," her mother said in a voice that wasn't hers. The final night, Jenna never left the house. The neighbors reported hearing screams late into the night, but by morning, the Harper family was gone. The house stood empty once again, the shattered mirror somehow restored to its place in the attic. And now, when the wind blows just right, passers-by swear they can hear whispers drifting from the attic. "Come upstairs. We're waiting." The silent town, Dawson, Wyoming, wasn't on any map Jenna could find. She'd never heard of it until her car broke down just outside its limits. The engine sputtered and died as she drove along a desolate stretch of road, her GPS losing signal minutes earlier. Frustrated but determined, she grabbed her phone, only to find no service. A sign loomed ahead, rusted and weather-worn, with the words barely legible, "Welcome to Dawson. Population 0. Confused, Jenna stepped out into the biting evening air. The town stretched ahead, a cluster of old buildings and narrow streets bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. Despite the Population 0 claim, she could see lights flickering in windows and faint silhouettes moving in the distance. An unsettling welcome. Jenna walked into the town, hoping to find help. The streets were eerily silent, the only sound coming from her boots crunching against the cracked pavement. The buildings looked like something out of the 1950s. A diner with a faded neon sign, a hardware store with tools displayed in dusty windows, and a gas station with rusted pumps. Inside the diner, a lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back to Jenna. "Excuse me," Jenna called, her voice echoing. The waitress didn't move. "My car broke down outside town. Can I use your phone?" The waitress turned slowly. Her face was unsettlingly blank. Her eyes glazed over as if she weren't fully awake. "No phones," she said in a monotone voice. "You should leave before dark." Before Jenna could respond, the waitress walked through a swinging door into the kitchen, leaving Jenna alone. She looked around, noticing that despite the lights being on, the diner seemed unused. Dust covered the tables, and the clock on the wall ticked but showed no time. The stranger. Outside, the streets were even quieter. The silhouettes Jenna had seen earlier were gone. The only movement was the flicker of a single street lamp at the far end of the road. She began walking toward it, anxiety tightening in her chest. "Lost, are we?" a voice said behind her. Jenna spun around to find an elderly man sitting on a bench. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, but his grin was unsettlingly wide. "My car broke down," she said cautiously. "Do you know where I can find a mechanic?" He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. No mechanics here. No one here but the shadows. What does that mean? Jenna asked, her voice shaking. His grin widened. It means you should have kept driving. Before she could question him further, a cold wind swept through the street, and when she blinked, the man was gone. The bench was empty, as if he'd never been there. Night falls. The sun dipped below the horizon faster than Jenna expected, plunging the town into darkness. The street lamps flickered weakly, their light barely cutting through the oppressive shadows. Jenna's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her car was miles back, and the road was pitch black. As she wandered, she began hearing things. Soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Jenna! A voice called, faint and raspy. She froze. Who's there? The whispers grew louder, overlapping and circling her. Jenna, stay with us. Panic gripped her. She broke into a run, her footsteps echoing unnaturally. The streets twisted in ways that didn't make sense, leading her in circles. No matter which way she turned, she always ended up back at the diner. Inside, the lights were off now. The interior was shrouded in darkness except for a faint, pulsing glow from the kitchen. Against her better judgment, Jenna pushed through the swinging door. The truth of Dawson. The kitchen was empty except for a single table in the center. On it sat an old photograph of the town, taken decades ago. Jenna picked it up, her breath hitching. The people in the photo were the silhouettes she'd seen earlier. But there was something else. Behind them, in the shadows of the buildings, were faint figures. Too tall, too thin, their faces featureless. As Jenna stared, the photograph began to change. The faces of the townsfolk blurred, replaced by hollow black voids. The tall figures grew clearer, their long limbs stretching unnaturally. A chill ran down Jenna's spine. She turned to leave but stopped dead. Standing in the doorway was one of the figures. It was tall, impossibly so, its head brushing the ceiling. Its featureless face tilted toward her, and though it had no eyes, she felt its gaze pierce her. The final chase. Jenna bolted, tearing through the streets. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the shadows began to move, reaching for her with claw-like tendrils. She didn't dare look back. She reached her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the door. Miraculously, the engine roared to life, and she sped away, the headlights cutting through the darkness. In the rearview mirror, she saw the figures standing in the middle of the road, watching her leave. Relief washed over her as she reached the highway. Her phone regained service and she called for a tow truck. When the driver arrived, she told him everything. You came from Dawson? He asked, his face pale. Yes, she said. Why? He shook his head. Dawson's been abandoned for 50 years. Burned to the ground after the entire town disappeared. If you saw it, you weren't supposed to leave. The epilogue. Jenna never spoke of Dawson again. But every so often, when she passed a dark road at night, she swore she could hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable. Jenna, come back. The cabin that waits. Deep in the woods of Maine, where cell signals failed, and the forest stretched endlessly, stood an old cabin. It wasn't marked on any map, and those who stumbled upon it often wished they hadn't. Locals called it the cabin that waits, a place tied to disappearances spanning decades. Despite the warnings, 5 college friends, Sam, Emma, Tyler, Lisa, and Brian, decided to rent a cabin for a weekend getaway. They laughed off the legends, chalking them up to small-town superstition. But when they arrived at the address their GPS led them to, they found themselves staring at a different cabin than the one in the listing photos. It was ancient, the wood warped and weathered, its windows cracked. Thick vines snaked up its sides, as if the forest were trying to reclaim it. The air felt heavy, and the shadows among the trees seemed to shift. This can't be the right place, Emma muttered, clutching her coat tighter. Maybe the listing's old, Tyler said. We've already driven 6 hours. Let's just make it work. They reluctantly unloaded their bags and stepped inside. Inside the cabin, the interior was just as unsettling. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled of mildew. Oddly, the fireplace was lit, the flames crackling as though someone had been there moments ago. Lisa shivered. Someone's been here. Or maybe it's automatic, Brian said, though his voice lacked conviction. The group settled in, unpacking and joking to shake off the unease. But the cabin felt wrong. Its angles seemed slightly skewed, and the walls seemed to breathe, faintly expanding and contracting. Emma discovered an old journal tucked under the couch. The leather was cracked, and the pages were yellowed. She opened it to the first entry, dated October 13th, 1923. To anyone who finds this, the cabin is alive. It sees you. It waits for the right moment to claim you. The first night, the friends laughed nervously over dinner, chalking up the journal to an elaborate prank by the owners. But as night fell, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No wind, no crickets, just oppressive silence. Around midnight, Sam jolted awake to the sound of footsteps on the porch. He crept to the window and peered out, but there was no one there. When he turned back, he froze. The fireplace had gone out, and the room was pitch black, except for the faint glow of two eyes staring at him from the corner. He scrambled for the light switch, and the room illuminated. There was nothing there. The second day. By morning, everyone was on edge. Tyler suggested they leave, but when they tried to start the car, the engine refused to turn over. Brian checked under the hood and found it packed with dirt, as though the forest itself had sabotaged their escape. "We're walking out," Lisa said firmly. They packed essentials and started down the dirt road. The GPS wasn't working, but Tyler insisted they'd find their way back to the main road. After hours of walking, they stumbled back to the cabin. "What the hell?" Emma whispered. "We've been walking straight." The cabin looked different. The wood was darker, the windows gaping open like empty sockets. The door stood ajar, inviting them in. The spiral. That night, the whispers began. Lisa heard them first, faint and raspy, calling her name. She swore she saw a figure in her window, standing just beyond the treeline. When she screamed, the others rushed in, but nothing was there. Later, Emma found another entry in the journal. "The cabin knows your fears. It will use them to pull you apart one by one. Don't listen to the voices." But the voices grew louder. By midnight, Brian was gone. His bed was empty, the sheets soaked in a strange, dark liquid. They searched the cabin and the surrounding woods, calling his name. Eventually, they found his flashlight near the edge of the forest. Next to it was a single footprint, large, misshapen, and clawed. The cabin's hunger. The next day, Tyler insisted on barricading the cabin, but Emma refused to stay inside. "This place is alive," she screamed. "It's trying to trap us." She ran into the woods, and Tyler followed, trying to stop her. Sam and Lisa stayed behind, huddled in the corner, clutching kitchen knives. Hours passed, but Tyler and Emma didn't return. When night fell, the whispers began again. This time, they weren't outside. They came from the walls. "Sam," the voice crooned, soft and mocking. "Lisa." The walls creaked, and shadows began to ooze from the corners, pooling on the floor. Sam grabbed Lisa's hand. "We have to go." The floorboards beneath him splintered, and black tendrils shot up, wrapping around his legs. He screamed as they dragged him down into the darkness. Lisa ran, slamming the door behind her. The final night, Lisa was alone. The journal lay open on the table, its final entry scrawled in blood. "Once you are alone, it will take you. You cannot run. You cannot hide. You are already part of it." The cabin groaned, its walls warping and closing in. The air grew cold, and the whispers became deafening. Lisa clutched a knife, backing into a corner as the shadows closed in. A voice, deep and resonant, spoke from the darkness. "You came to me. Now you belong to me." The last thing Lisa saw was the cabin itself splitting open, revealing a vast, gaping maw of darkness. Aftermath. Weeks later, hikers found the cabin in pristine condition, with no sign of the Harpers or their belongings. The journal was gone, replaced by a new one, its first entry written in Lisa's handwriting. 1. To anyone who finds this, the cabin is alive. It sees you. It waits for the right moment to claim you, and so the cabin waits, always waiting for the next visitor who dares to step inside. The shadows beneath Blackwater Lake. Blackwater Lake was a place of contradictions. By day, it was picturesque. Crystal clear waters surrounded by dense pines and distant mountains, a favorite spot for hikers and campers. But by night, it transformed. Locals whispered of unnatural shadows moving across the lake's surface and chilling cries echoing through the forest. For decades, the legends were enough to keep people away after sunset, until the summer of 1997, when 5 friends decided to camp there. Jamie, the leader of the group, had heard the stories but dismissed them as small-town myths. His girlfriend, Rachel, was less enthusiastic. Along with their friends Ethan, Chloe, and Marcus, they packed supplies and set off for the lake on a sunny July morning, blissfully unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. Day 1, the warning. The hike to Blackwater Lake was beautiful but uneventful. As they reached the clearing that overlooked the lake, the friends paused to take in the view. The water shimmered under the midday sun, and the surrounding forest seemed alive with the hum of insects and the calls of birds. "See," Jamie said with a grin. "Nothing creepy about this place." Rachel didn't reply. She had an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. While setting up camp, they encountered an elderly man fishing near the shore. His weathered face was grim as he watched them approach. "You shouldn't stay here after dark," he warned. "Why not?" Jamie asked, smirking. The old man's eyes were cold. "The lake doesn't like visitors. And the shadows. They'll find you if you stay." With that, he packed up his gear and left without another word. Night 1, the first sighting. As night fell, the group gathered around the campfire, laughing and sharing stories. The lake was eerily still, reflecting the starry sky like a black mirror. Around midnight, Chloe wandered to the shore, her camera in hand. She was an aspiring photographer and couldn't resist the moonlight's glow on the water. She snapped a few shots, but when she reviewed them, her breath hitched. In each photo, faint shadows floated on the lake's surface, shadows that hadn't been there moments ago. "Guys," she called, her voice shaking. "Come look at this." The group crowded around her camera. "Probably just a trick of the light," Jamie said, but his voice lacked confidence. Suddenly, a low, mournful wail echoed across the water. The group froze. "What the hell was that?" Ethan whispered. The wail came again, louder this time, and seemed to be moving closer. The friends retreated to their tents, agreeing to investigate in the morning. Day 2, the strange discovery. The next morning, the group awoke to find strange, wet footprints leading from the lake to their campsite. The prints were elongated, almost human but with clawed toes. Rachel wanted to leave, but Jamie convinced everyone to stay. "It's just a prank," he insisted. "Probably that old guy trying to scare us." While exploring the area, they stumbled upon an old cabin hidden in the woods. It was dilapidated, the roof caving in and vines creeping up the walls. Inside, they found faded photographs and water-damaged journals. The photos showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, posing by Blackwater Lake. But in the background of each photo, there were faint shapes in the water. Rachel opened one of the journals, the last entry dated August 5, 1943. "We can't leave. The shadows won't let us. They come every night, whispering our names. We're running out of time." Night 2, the shadows rise. That night, the atmosphere was different. The air felt heavier, the forest unnaturally silent. As the group sat by the fire, the wailing began again, louder and closer than the night before. Then came the whispers, faint, almost inaudible, but growing clearer with each passing second. Jamie, Rachel, Chloe, the friends huddled together, their flashlights scanning the darkness. Shadows began to ripple across the lake's surface, defying the firelight. Slowly they rose, humanoid shapes emerging from the water. Ethan screamed, bolting for the woods. "Ethan, no!" Jamie shouted, but it was too late. The shadows moved impossibly fast, engulfing him. His screams were cut off as he vanished. The remaining four ran for the cabin, barricading the door with broken furniture. Outside, the shadows circled, their whispering voices pressing against the walls. "We have to get out of here," Rachel sobbed. Jamie nodded, his bravado gone. "At sunrise. We leave at sunrise." The final morning. By dawn, the shadows retreated into the lake. The friends emerged from the cabin, shaken but alive. They returned to the campsite to gather their things, only to find Ethan's backpack sitting neatly by the fire. Inside was a note, scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. "He's with us now. You will be too." Panicked, they fled, leaving their gear behind. The hike back was grueling, and they felt eyes on them the entire way. When they finally reached their car, they found the tires slashed and the windows shattered. Desperate, they started walking down the road. A few miles out, they flagged down a truck driver who agreed to take them to the nearest town. Epilogue. Weeks later, Jamie and Rachel returned to the lake with police, hoping to recover Ethan's body. But there was no trace of their campsite or the cabin. The lake was still and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. Locals told them that Blackwater Lake had a history of strange disappearances, dating back to the 1800s. No one who vanished was ever found. And at night, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers. Jamie,